This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
It was a fort built to protect a fort. Its trapezoidal shape was meant to act as a deterrent for Confederate troops as they tried to attack Fort Barrancas from the west. Of the 42 third system forts built from 1820 to 1870, this was the last one. It's the Advanced Redoubt, and if you ever find yourself on Pensacola's Naval Air Station, you'll discover it right in your own backyard. The structure was built over the course of 20 years, from 1850 to 1870. The Advanced Redoubt was one of 4 forts constructed to protect the Pensacola Bay after the War of 1812. Now, tours are available to see this unique and sometimes spooky fortress. Let's go.
My name is Jeff Massey. I'm a park ranger, park guide, predominantly for Fort Barrancas and for the Advanced Redoubt side area of the Islands National Seashore. I've been a park guide, park ranger for about 2 years now. It's a fantastic career path. It's a great profession. It's a great opportunity for me to talk to the public about our Civil War forts and our heritage here in Pensacola. What we have here is this is the Advanced Redoubt of Barrancas. It didn't get its own name per se, like Fort McRee or Fort Pickens or Fort Barrancas. It just kind of had this nebulous name, and the name of it is actually in the appropriations as the Advanced Redoubt of Fort Barrancas. It was actually designed as a land defense to anchor the approaches from a threat coming from the west to defend Fort Barrancas. If you look and if you know anything about the history of our particular forts here in Pensacola Bay, you have Fort Pickens, which is on Santa Rosa Island. You have Fort McRee, which is on Perdido Key. Then you have Fort Barrancas, which is on the mainland. Well, McRee and Fort Pickens have the natural protection of a barrier island to protect them. But Fort Barrancas' problem, they were worried about an invasion coming from the west. Particularly, there was a precedent that this occurred. Andrew Jackson took this area in 1812, 1814, in the War of 1812, and again in 1818. So they were aware when they were building this fort that there was this opportunity for a threat coming from the west. We're going to walk up there and I'm going to show you what this threat would have looked like. This is the parade ground for the fort. The parade ground is where the officer would give his orders to his cannons, to his gunners on the cannons. Any general military business would be conducted here. The guard reports would be made, and they would be waiting here in some type of a defensive fashion. Now, this fort has a couple of unique characteristics about it that kind of separate it from the other forts. There were 42 third system forts built from about 1820 until 1870. This is the last of the structures that was completed in 1870 for the third system forts. Kind of another irony of history here is this particular fort was started with the labor of slaves in 1850 and it was completed with the labor of freemen in 1870, so a span of 20 years. It also has another first. While it was slavery that built the fort, because that was the currency of labor at the time, because Pensacola didn't have a very large labor force, particularly during the 1840s and 1850s. This was also the site of a Confederate battle where they made an attack from the landward aside from the west, and the fort actually had the opportunity to be defended by men of color. They were the precursors for the U.S. Colored Troop. They were an African regiment that was here along with the 7th Vermont, which was a volunteer militia company. And for a brief period in October of 1863, for a 2-day period, they did repulse a Confederate dismounted cavalry attack from the west. Now, what's kind of hard to see in this area, because we're devoid of any cannon, there would have been howitzer cannon in position on each of the corners of the flanks. And this particular fort is called a redoubt. And a redoubt is a British military term for basically a square fortification. This one's kind of a trapezoid, though. It doesn't get the correct, true geometry shape of a square. And the reason for that is they wanted to have a way to protect from an attack from the front, and then they also had to be able to protect it from the rear. And the rear side of it has two bastions on each corner. They're actually demi-bastions where they can support howitzers to be able to protect the rear of the fort in case enemy infantry tried to take refuge against the back wall. This, in military terms, is called breastworks, and the reason for that is it's about the same height of a breast for a man. To be able to stand here with his rifle and be able to project a very slow, very low profile for a defender. Stop for a moment.
is located at the departure end of a current Sherman Field runway on Naval Air Station Pensacola. These are contrasting examples of two military eras, both of which were at the pinnacle of military technology.
So a defender, he's got the ability to defend the approaches that would be looking out here. This is facing out to the west. Now, in the time that the forts were built, we're talking in 1850 to 1870, there would have been no trees here. A couple of reasons for that. Any type of vegetation or trees would have been used in the construction of the forts, but also during the Civil War period between 1861 and 1862, they went from 51 federal soldiers who evacuated Pensacola area and went over to Fort Pickens. And they very slowly, in a matter of about 3 to 4 months, went from 0 to 8,000 Confederate soldiers. Now, those Confederate soldiers had to use the woods, any type of lumber for their winter encampments, but also for energy for to be able to prepare their meals, to build some type of shelters, but also to use for drill fortifications. And then when the men were doing nothing, they had to have some type of work to do. So the officers would have had them clearing a lot of the lumber out here to keep a natural fortification. You want to have as much visibility between here and where you expect your enemy attackers to come from. So this whole area here would have been devoid of any type of trees. There's a natural slope right there. The slope rises. It's called a glacis in military terms. And what it does is it provides an artificial barrier with gravity where you're forcing an enemy attacker to have to use the forces of physics to have to advance up a slope under fire, and then he still has to get into this main area of the fort itself. So the redoubt in tactical terms really was a delaying fort. It wasn't designed to be a standalone fort to withstand a siege, but it didn't have to. All it had to do was be able to deter an attack coming from the west, filter the troops around it, like a road bump, if you will, until the main flying column and relief could come from Fort Barrancas. The Confederates abandoned Pensacola in May of 1862. The Federals quickly came back over here. It's kind of hard to picture this, what it would have looked like in the 1850s and 1870s. But there would have been a line of trenches that would have connected the Advanced Redoubt of Fort Barrancas to the Fort Barrancas proper. And inside those areas would have been earthworks where soldiers would have had a position, and if a bugle was called, or if a flag was flown, or a musket was fired, or even a cannon, the men that were in defense of this area would know where to go in their particular defense of that line and defend the area from an attack.
In 1863, about 200 dismounted soldiers, led by a Confederate cavalry general named Clanton, attacked this location. And who was helping to defend the Advanced Redoubt? U.S. color troops. You can imagine what the general was thinking when he saw that the United States had armed black soldiers. The Confederate attack was quickly stopped, and the redoubt was never attacked again.
From the period of 1863 till about 1865, this was a staging area. They would have done some punitive raids out in the area to wanted to protect the farms, but they were also looking for constabulary forces from the Confederates that were trying to round up military-age men. As soon as they would come through, or they would be reported, columns of cavalry and infantry would leave this area from federal troops and go out and try to protect the surrounding areas. And this occurred until the end of the war in 1865. So some of the terms about the Advanced Redoubt: anywhere you see the brick wall where there's a recess cut into it, that's where a howitzer position would have been located. A howitzer is a small cannon, about 3 foot long. It is designed to carry or to project flesh hit or canister or case shot. And the case shot and canister shot was designed to be anti-personnel rounds. They wanted to try to use, like a shotgun, if you will, to project as much metal in a quick area over a short distance to break up an infantry attack. This fort obviously wasn't designed to try to shoot against another fort because there's no other fort out there, so it would have been solely to defend the area against an infantry attack. You have high ground. Conversely, at the rear of the fort, there's a bunch of slots, and I'll point those out to you, and those slots are called rifle loopholes. The rear of the fort is actually it's kind of counterintuitive, but it's actually the strongest part of the fort, because this is where the sally port is, where the soldiers inside the fort would come inside, they would start their defenses, and they would man these rifle ports. They also would man the exterior walls of the ramparts. And I'm going to take you in a moment down below and show you the scarp or the rifle galleries to where they could actually put a defender, their defenders could put an attacking force into a crossfire. So these loopholes, you could put a musket, say an 1861 Springfield. It could have, projecting through the loophole, you have a pretty wide field of coverage between 40 and 90 degrees, where all you are presenting is your musket rifle barrel and possibly a little bit of your body, but the attacker, you can see his entire body fortification. As he's trying to run into the fort or against the wall to try to attack it, he has to get $1 million shot. He's got to get it between the small little slits of the rifle loopholes. So you can see that the defender has a huge advantage over an attacker. Another thing that the defender has in his ability is you have each one of these are supporting each other so they can give mutual fire. So you're getting into a crisscross action or a crossfire just from the rear of the fort. So if the defender gets against the wall, now he's going to have another problem. And I'm going to show you what that looks like.
The fort's brick foundation was started by slaves in the 1850s. The cutting and the shaping of the bricks are beautiful. And to think about the tools of the trade back then, it was not as it is today.
You can actually see the chisel marks, and it's more pronounced in the other forts, particularly at Fort Barrancas, but you can see the chisel marks and the cut work of the brickwork. I try to imagine what it would have been like to be a slave here, working 12-hour days, 6 to 7 days a week. What would the calluses on a man's hand have looked like to be able to handle this brickwork day in and day out for years? It's a thought that I kind of try to put into the visitors when they come through. We have very soft hands these days. I couldn't imagine just the sheer calluses on these gentlemen's hands. And the brickwork, even today, it's still sharp. It could cut you in certain areas, particularly up here. It's impressive.
There are arches everywhere throughout Advanced Redoubt, giving it a Roman architectural feel. Now, most of us grew up in homes with 8-foot ceilings, but look at this room, it's huge. There are rooms like this throughout the fort. The arches continue underground for superior strength. Then they're packed with sand and covered with brick flooring.
Some of the highlights and technical aspects of the fort here, you can see we're getting some whitewash inside the fort. The purpose of that really is to demonstrate it. If you were to shine the light through here, it's kind of dark, but as you look down the passageways here through the gallery, the white does some ambient lighting, it does some reflection, so it projects that light out. That's particularly important because on the back side of this wall is a powder magazine, and you wouldn't want to have any candlelight or any type of a lit match while you're trying to see your way through these galleries with that powder magazine, which is right behind it. Can't really show you any real detail because there's no light in here. The powder magazines at Fort Barrancas are in much better shape, but this does show you a condition of an unfinished powder mag, and it would have been brick lined, it would have had a wooden floor, there would have been a wooden roof as well, and the wood would have had a purpose of, one, keeping the powder off the floor, and two, to try to provide some type of moisture barrier to keep that powder dry. Everywhere where you see a powder magazine inside of a main battery of a fort, you can make the presumption that there's a howitzer position or a cannon position nearby. You didn't want to have to move the powder, which was extremely volatile, to certain areas of the fort unless you absolutely had to.
From the parade grounds to the dry moat to the interior of the fort, an enemy soldier would have had little chance of advancing without being met with a barrage of rifle, howitzer, and cannon fire. Now, it was this defensive strategy that created a menacing reputation for our 4 Pensacola forts and made European and Confederate forces definitely think twice before attacking.
As you're looking down these galleries, you're going to see some sand, and the sand is still in place behind these retaining walls. The retaining walls are actually concave, and they're that way for a purpose. It's actually an arch. And behind it is supporting the sand. As the sand hits an arch, what happens is it disperses the weight of that sand equally across that arch. So not one point of it is getting more pressure than the other point. What they did was they filled the interior of the parade ground with sand and dirt to the maximum level of height where they wanted to place their cannon. And they allowed that sand to make its way down to the natural level of the ground. That halfway point where the sand is no longer falling or no longer rising or putting pressure on it is called a repose. And that is about equal to where the coincidental height is that they built these retaining walls to. So as we walk through it, you're going to look at the sand. That sand is actually the parade ground up above. This is an example of the sand of the parade ground as it's filling. Now it's blocked right here, and it's blocked for the purpose of, this is the height that they determined that repose occurs. As you can see, that sand, if you were to take a core sample, literally down into it with some post hole diggers, you're going back into the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s when they built this fort. The retaining walls are still intact, and as long as they are, the parade ground will last. And again, you can really see the effect of the white and the ambient lighting and how it projects that light through the fort. The height of the fort walls, this is about as high as they would have been. Your average soldier would have been about 5'4", 5'3", would have weighed about 130 pounds. And he would have had talking about both Federal and Confederate during this time frame. And he would have had between 60, maybe 40 to 60 pounds of equipment and gear on him. And their rifles, believe it or not, were sometimes even taller than the soldiers. So the real issue here, you could massively pass troops back very quickly in here in these communication areas, and they have the ability to project firepower through the loopholes as they move. As you look through the loophole here, you can see the retaining wall, and on that retaining wall, there are other loopholes. And in those loopholes, you create, it's a dry moat, it's actually a killing field. It is creating a counterfire or a crossfire for a defender. This is the south wall, which we're facing in the main gallery. And I'd like to point out, you can notice that the walls on the interior and the exterior don't touch each other. This is an engineering principle found at both the Fort Pickens and at Fort Barrancas. And what it's really designed to do is they built the interior of the fort first. And as you can see, there's the parade ground sand that's supporting the parade ground. And as it makes its way down, they build the retaining walls. Then they had the problem of supporting an exterior wall. Well, you don't want to join it together. If you have two pieces of masonry that are joined at a 90-degree angle, what occurs, especially if they're on a seacoast area where there's sand and soft dirt, they can slowly project, pull each other down, and cause fatigue on the fort. To solve that engineering problem, they actually made the walls, the exterior of the fort and the interior, independent, so they can actually settle and rise with each other. A couple of coincidences occur from that. The gap actually creates kind of an ambient airflow. It's noticeable, particularly in different times of the year, the late summer or and in the winter, allows some of the airflow to come through, which is critically important for powder. Another purpose is, if you do take damage on an exterior part of the wall, it's much easier to repair a section of a wall than lose your entire fort from having it joined at that 90-degree angle. These giant gaps in the middle here, that's for black powder ventilation. If you shoot a black powder rifle, it's not smokeless, it's black powder. So it's going to cause a lot of choking fumes in here, it's going to cause some visibility issues. They very quickly wanted to get that powder out, and that's the way that they solved that problem. And now we are on the west wall of the main gallery. And this is the main defense of the fort for the interior design of the fort. What would happen is men would be on that wall, on that breastwork, projecting firepower out to the access coming from the west. Men in here would be giving them mutual fire support. And down in the smaller gallery down below, that where the dry moat is, you're now injecting them into a crossfire. So it's a very sound military tactic. You can do it with an economy of men. And the attacker really has to know the layout of this to understand, one, how he's going to get into the fort, and two, where the defenders are going to project their power from. This is showing that dark alley. Even the jet aircraft are loud in here. Imagine what a cannon would sound like if it was to go off in this particular area too. The sound would be deafening, or the roar of the muskets even. As you look down this gallery here, this is the longest linear length of it. This is facing west again. And this is a reverse angle of what we just came down. So we're actually just going to go back to the way we came.
This fort, like the others, became a part of Gulf Islands National Seashore in 1971. That helps preserve and protect it. Fort Pickens across the bay still exists. Fort Barrancas still stands strong, less than a mile south of us. But Fort McRee was blown apart by two Federal Navy ships in 1861. Its remains later washed into Pensacola Pass.
We have a lot of wildlife is taking this area back over. Here you can see some stalactites. And we also have stalagmites, as long as the dirt up there is supporting it. We also have rodents, quite a lot of rodents. The area that we're about to go into on the Campanier, it's a gallery that will take us below to the counterscarp. We have an opportunity to see some brown bats that are in there. Kind of an oxymoron. They're called big brown bats, but yet they're about this tall. And if they're in there as we walk by them, it's always a great visitor experience for them to be able to interact with a bat. And they realize that they're not these giant vampire things that are going to try to suck your blood. So as we do walk through, I'll just caution you, you'll see them. They'll be a little sensitive to the light that I'll shine. In the wintertime, we average between 25, 30 bats per gallery, and they will be tucked up into every little nook and cranny inside here. And we do have a brown bat here. Okay, what we're looking at here, this is the natural area of this area. This is the Campanier. It's actually the drainage system of the fort. That's why we see this white sand here. This is typical of the white sand that was It's in our area, predominantly with our bricks and our beaches. And it comes from the Appalachian Mountain Train, and this is the quartz that's left over. But what we're looking at here, as it makes its way through, nature's taking over again, and that's why we're seeing these bat colonies in here. Right now, they're starting to kind of scout it out, but by the wintertime, I've counted individually between 30 and 40 bats in each of these campanières. So as we walk by them, you can kind of check them out. They shouldn't move very often. They're kind of resting. They're nocturnal, but they are awake. This one's looking at me. So let's see how they react. Yeah, he's awake, but he's just kind of doing his thing. There he goes, and he just fledged. As we walk on, you'll see two more up here again in the wall. You can tell our fort slowly becoming a habitat again for wildlife. These are where a lot of rats and other type of critters can get inside here, particularly when the rats come in. Then of course the snakes come in. So your chances of a wildlife encounter on this particular tour are pretty good.
This is called a countermine. There are several of these along the interior wall of the fort. If the enemy were on top of the fort trying to dig their way inside from the parade grounds, the defender has a few options. He can dig his way up to meet the enemy, or he can take a more drastic approach. He can pack these mines full of gunpowder, wait until the siege is upon him, and detonate. The theory behind this decision is, if I can't keep this fort, then you can't have it either.
You really can't tell the story of the coastal forts of Pensacola, particularly Pickens, McRee, and Barrancas, without talking about the bricks. When they started with Fort Pickens in 1832, Pensacola, particularly Florida, was only a territory for about 10 years. And what occurred there was they didn't have an industry to be able to produce the brickworks that were going to be the mainstay of the third system masonry forts. By the time they get over to Fort, and they used that, the brickwork was actually brought in along with the labor from New Orleans. By the time they get over to Fort McRee, and particularly at Fort Barrancas, the brickwork contracts in the industry in this area really took off. A couple reasons for that. One is the civilian contracts were starting to be awarded. They became inventive when they wanted a little bit of that government money. So they were able to contract out a lot of the brickwork. Major Chase notoriously gave it contracts to his friends, particularly the Gonzalez family, the Bonifay family, and those are names that still resonate here in Pensacola. The town of Gonzalez is an example up off of 29 between Cantonment. This particular brick here, it's stamped with an IBCO. It could be the Bonifay Brick Company, hard to say. They did have, and we know these are original bricks, they did have particular brickwork with their stamps and their logo. Here's another one that has a diamond on it. That's a brick stamp for a particular brick company. Hard to say, but I did want to illustrate to you the massive amount of bricks. So it's one of the number one questions we get here. Where did all the bricks come from? The bricks, 21.5 at Pickens and 6 million here. They're very significant. I'm talking about in the Barrancas area. They're very significant for building the forts. And those numbers and the location and where they came from is always a question that people would like to know. As we continue, and I said earlier, anytime you come across a powder magazine, you probably have a cannon battery or a howitzer battery nearby. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. This is actually the main defense of the fort. Interior-wise, the two howitzer batteries, which are co-located here in casemate, they can provide a terrible volley of fire down this dry moat lane. And if you were to look down it through the rifle loops, you could see as the men tried to get in, the attacker, get into that dry moat, they're facing crossfire from both sides, from the rear of the fort and from the counterscarp, and now they have to face this terrible hell of twin howitzers that are going to basically shred them apart with nails, canister, case shot, and grape shot. It's almost advantageous to the defender to allow the attacker, bait him in, let him get into that dry moat, and then open fire on him. I think it would probably break the first attack, and then the second attackers would probably retreat. They certainly wouldn't want to enter into it knowing certain death was going to occur by these howitzers. Very formidable defense, and it's hidden because that's the west side where the attackers would try to come over the top of this wall. So it's a very ingenious design by the Corps of Engineers to defend the fort. And here you're coming out. This is on the opposite side of the fort, so now we're on the north wall. And what we've done is we've done a complete 360 through the fort without ever being exposed to the top side. And now you can really get a sense of how you can defend the positions. We've already saw how you could rake soldiers off on that side. Well, this is the mutual supporting howitzer battery on this side, and they would have the same function. So for a defender to be able to completely go 360 subterranean from your attacker, one, you disguise your troop strength, the numbers of soldiers that you have defending the fort, and two, you're able to economize and be in a bunch of different places what would appear very rapidly, which would certainly confuse an attacker.
Not to be confused with graffiti, soldiers used lead pencils and bayonets to carve their names and dates into the brick mortar walls throughout Redoubt. Begun by slaves and completed by freemen, this is the smallest of Pensacola's 4 forts and was in military use for 104 years. To get to the Advanced Redoubt, just take Blue Angel Parkway south to the west entrance of NAS Pensacola. Go through the guard shack and continue about 3 miles. The fort entrance will be on your left. We hope you've enjoyed this look at the last third system fort ever built in the United States. I'm Sherri Hemminghaus Weeks. We'll see you again next time, right in your own backyard.